Hello, everyone. Well, I had spent quite a number of live stream sessions going through what amounted to the story of my life. Fortunately, we managed to speed up in the more recent few decades, although I think I just said a lot less about what had been going on. But there were lots of questions, and so I thought I would do a session today trying to um, uh, go through some of those questions. Let's see. I see the first question here from Gray. If every decade of your life were a chapter title in a book, what would they be called? Boy, that's complicated. I think I have an online scrapbook where I've uh, tried to, uh, I think they'd be very generic. The first decade of my life is kind of getting started. The second decade would probably be uh, becoming a physicist or something. That was sort of the arc of what happened in the second decade. The kind of third decade would be probably um, kind of computation and complexity. Those were sort of the themes of that decade. The uh, the next decade, which would now be the 1990s, would be a new kind of science. That was what that decade was spent on. The decade after that probably be the uh, the the Wolfram Alpha decade, the computational knowledge decade, um, the uh, the decade after that, um, the 2010s, I guess would be the computational language decade, and the 2020s would probably be the uh, fundamental fundamental theory decade of that would be my first approximation of decades of my life as chapter titles. Those aren't as zingy chapter titles as I might come up with, but that's a start there. Let's see. Mark asks, do you think your life has been more shaped by the things you said yes to or the things you said no to? You know, certainly the things I said yes to, because the number of things I've said no to is fairly limited. It's mostly things where I've tried it and it didn't really make sense for me, and so I stopped doing it. There are rather few things where I sort of definitively, made a point of saying no. I suppose one of them would be in the things I've done in sort of business and companies and so on. There have been many choices, many cases where there's sort of door number one, make more money, do something less interesting. Door number two, make less money, do something more interesting. And I always pick door number two. But I don't really even think about it because it's been something that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in doing things that I find interesting or I find fulfilling and worthwhile. And the kind of make the business bigger for the sake of making the business bigger is something that just isn't my particular interest. I mean, there are people where the main interest is to make their business more successful, bigger, and so on. I want the business to be solid and as successful as it can be, but that isn't the primary objective. The primary objective is the things that we're trying to achieve, we're trying to create, trying to do in the world, so to speak, rather than that objective. I suppose other things, I sort of was an academic professor, whatever, for a while. Um, as soon as there was sort of a different path, I chose the different path, not because I preferred that path, and it wasn't it was something where I kind of knew what I was walking away from, so to speak. I'm trying to think of other things where I sort of said no, and it was a mistake. I think usually I'm when it's kind of should I do this? I kind of usually study the this carefully enough that I'm pretty much I don't feel like I'm making a mistake in doing that, and if I don't do it, it's like that was the natural thing not to do. So I don't think that's it's not really been the story of my life. Um, let's see. Uh, well, question. By the time I was like 8 years old, did I have an early idea of what you wanted to do? Any thoughts that you would go into academia and so on? Um, by the time I was 8 years old, I wanted to do something. I would say by the time I was probably 6 or 7 years old, I wanted to do something that related to the future, that wasn't a backward looking kind of thing. It was a forward future looking kind of thing. I think that I realized by the time I saw the movie 2001, which was when I was 8 years old or something, that was kind of I want to be part of that flashy future that's portrayed in a movie like that. And I think the I suppose my interest in things like space was probably more born out of the desire to be sort of looking to the future than the specifics of space itself. And then I would say if somebody had said, I guess by the time I was maybe 11 years old or something, it was like, I'm going to be a scientist when I'm grown up. And that was, if you'd say, what kind of science, I would have said physics at that time. That wasn't such a difficult thing to decide because physics was kind of the biggest, fanciest science, or not necessarily biggest, but the sort of most prominent science of the time, so to speak. So I was pretty set in that direction pretty early on, and I think, of course, the actuality of my life, I've ended up doing things that aren't just sort of being a physicist, but that was sort of my theory of myself back when I was much younger. Um, in terms of being an academic, well, I knew what was involved in being an academic because my mother was an academic, and the sort of there were academics all around when I was growing up in Oxford. Um, and at least I thought I knew what being an academic consisted of. It seemed like it didn't seem like a very dynamic life to me at the time. It seemed like something where it was kind of let's just sort of sit around and ponder things. And, which is something that was the 8 year old me or whatever, not necessarily the modern me, but that was my view of that. That was, I mean, the sort of the dynamic world of the future as portrayed in something like, the movie 2001 seemed far away from kind of the stone buildings and the kind of sort of old people wearing gowns type thing of academia, at least as I could see it at the time. Let's see. Well, Dustin asks, what's the most sci-fi thing that's actually happened in your life? Well, there are lots of places, even the movie 2001, where there's kind of a know-it-all type computer. And I suppose through things that have happened in the world and through things that I've tried to build myself, we have, the know-it-all computer has become a real thing. I think in so many things that one kind of thought would happen did happen, like whether it's, display technology, whether it's small computers that you could pick up, whether it's uh, all those kinds of things. There was a lot that was kind of in the trajectory that was expected, but looked very science fictiony. I mean, the idea that there's this sort of thing you can hold in your hand that is a computer and has a display and does all these kinds of things looked science fictiony in the 1960s, although it was definitely a path that one could see things were on. So I suppose those are some of the kinds of things. Graham is asking, if you weren't the one telling your life story, who would you trust to narrate it? Oh boy. Well, I just on Monday was talking to an attempted AI clone of myself. I wasn't totally convinced by it. I thought it probably seemed better to somebody other than me. I think one is most sensitive to what one is like for oneself, so to speak. Um, I think the I wouldn't yet trust the AI clone to narrate my story if I wanted the story to be a correct story. It made up a bunch of things that were completely far wide of the mark in terms of my actual life story. I would say that uh, I don't, it's an interesting thing because I've written a fair amount of history and biography, and doing those kinds of things is hard. I think the uh, um, 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 the I think one of the things I've discovered is that sort of decoding lives from the documents that are left behind and even people you talk to is a difficult thing. It takes real work. It takes real kind of analytical skill to sort of knit the pieces together. And there are people who've written good biographies that I are impressed with, and there are plenty that have written quite weak biographies where they didn't do that. They didn't connect the dots. They didn't join the threads together, and they have things that aren't really a good representation of what actually happened. So it's a challenging thing, I think. Um, Elsie is asking, any personal recollections around salon type gatherings and such from early days? Oh boy. Well, I remember there was a thing when I was in Oxford. There was a little outfit that called itself the Oxford Natural Science Club. And it was, I think, mostly graduate students. I was actually in touch with one of them at least, in the last couple of years. I think now probably retired chemistry professor. But it had some little gatherings. I remember one gathering actually was with a chap called Richard Dawkins. The only time I ever met Richard Dawkins was probably must have been 1976. And he just, I think he was about to publish his book, The Selfish Gene, um, and was giving this kind of, was having this sort of talk discussion with probably, I don't know what it was, half a dozen student types of whom I was one. I gave a talk for that group. I actually found the kind of notes from that recently. I think it was I found the notes interesting because it was kind of a diagram that showed sort of the as a function of sort of number of elements in a system and physical size of a system, what we knew about physics so far. So things like, the universe has lots of elements, it's very big. There's sort of different corners, and I sort of colored it green and red depending on how much was known about those particular areas. And I suppose I'm at the time I was already interested in the second law of thermodynamics, which is a case of large numbers of things and not so much kind of concern with I think the axis was size versus number of components. But I remember that was one corner of it, which I feel like I finally was able to fill in recently. And there's sort of another big corner that I think our physics project is now able to fill in. But that was my contribution to that. Um, Later on, I'm trying to think about other kind of salon-like gatherings. I think when I was at Caltech, um, there really weren't those kinds of things. I mean, there were the sort of theoretical physics seminars, which I started organizing at some point, but they weren't really in the nature of a general discussion type salon. I think this must have been, oh, 83, 84, sometime like that. Um, when I was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, there was one such salon-like thing that started up that was a thing that was called the Reality Club. It was started by a chap called John Brockman, who was a kind of a literary agent for science kinds of things, so still around, uh, and has agented many popular science books, so to speak. He started this thing called the Reality Club. I think he told me that I was pretty close to its first ever speaker. It was kind of a thing happening in John Brockman's apartment in New York City. It was an interesting group, but that was an example of kind of an early salon-like gathering. I didn't go to any other ones. I only went to the one where I was kind of um, uh, giving some kind of talk discussion type thing. Um, I think, as I was mentioning before, the concept of kind of mixed gatherings of people was not such a popular concept back in those days. I mean, another place where that mixing happened was in things like Oxford and Cambridge colleges. But again, it was mostly that was kind of the high table crowd of kind of the academics, what would now be called professors, coming in to lunch or dinner, and the kind of the student crowd was probably much more numerous, and so much more kind of concentrated into much smaller, much cliquier types of groups. I mean, I remember that there were a variety of different people that I would kind of regularly kind of eat lunch with, but they were rather, I mean, they were rather physics thematic. I mean, one of them happened to be a chap called Ash Carter, who was then a physics graduate student, later became Secretary of Defense in the US. And there were other people with different kinds of stories, but they were mostly physics people. They were not kind of a well-mixed crowd, so to speak. And I think the concept of sort of well-mixed get-togethers was quite rare. I mean, I think I mentioned before the MacArthur Foundation used to have these get-togethers every few years, and I started going to those in probably early 1982, something like that. That was certainly there were all kinds of interesting characters there. Gosh, who do I remember? Lots of well-known people who aren't around anymore. I remember Barbara McClintock, a geneticist, person, Stephen Jay Gould, another evolutionary biologist, both people I interacted with at those get-togethers. Um, lots of uh, um, lots of literary folk and so on, where I was always a bit challenged because I didn't really know their stories, but they were interesting to talk to. Um, and I think I'm trying to remember I mean, I remember the very first MacArthur get together. It was probably not more than 25 people, maybe. And the I thought it was interesting that a number of people who had got these fellowships didn't show up to this get together. And I thought it was a mistake because I thought it was going to be interesting because it was going to be a mixture of folk from different kinds of fields. And I think people kind of assumed in those days, quite incorrectly, that everybody who showed up would be like, I'm so proud to be a, whatever, which really wasn't the case. I mean, maybe that was a selection effect of the people who actually showed up. Um, I'm thinking about other kind of salon type gatherings. Another one that I went to, must have been, that was much later, it was 1993, was an early World Economic Forum. Um, they had some kind of sort of future leaders, something or other thing. And it was at a time actually sort of still before the web. And so I remember I get this invitation from this thing in Switzerland that was, the World Economic Forum. What is this thing? I have no idea what this thing is. And so we looked it up and it was like, oh, actually, this seems pretty interesting. I'll go to this. But I could tell there were a bunch of other people, particularly from the US tech scene, who'd sort of were part of this, future leaders, whatever thing, and who I know it would have benefited to go to this more than it benefited me because there were a lot of kind of political leaders and so on there who are interesting to meet, but aren't really particularly haven't been my kind of main, sort of kind of interactors. But the I think these other people just didn't do the due diligence. They didn't look it up. They didn't find out what it was, and so they didn't go to it. Let's see. Question about music. Um, I'm really not. I'm one of these people who kind of enjoys music when I'm exposed to it, but tend to not get exposed to it very much, not least because my I really I tend to when I'm working on something and concentrating on something, I really can't deal with any outside distractive something or other. And I'm one of these work in a completely quiet environment. Actually, I've gotten better in modern times at being able to just sort of by force of will block out anything that's going on around. Um, but when I was a kid, I learned the piano for a bunch of years, and I think I was higher on talent than I was on interest, and kind of quickly gave it up. And I think I haven't really. I haven't been motivated. A couple of my children do music kinds of things quite seriously, but I've it skipped my generation, so to speak. The Let's see. John asks, have you been through times that were personally difficult? If so, did you find them isolating? I don't know. I can't claim to have had a terribly difficult life, thankfully. I mean, that's largely by design. Um, it's something where I've always had things that I wanted to do that kind of I could see as things that I could go ahead and do. I mean, I have ended up with a life where I always view it as being sort of a worthwhile to have a portfolio of different things that one's doing, whether it's running companies, doing science, having kids, interacting with the world in different kinds of ways. And at any given time, yeah, there are always sort of things that go wrong, frustrations, things that are not the way one would like them. I have not tended to find it. I think for better or worse, I'm one of these rather optimistic, sort of fundamentally not, not given to sort of. I mean, there are things that frustrate me, but they don't lead to sort of uh, core downness, so to speak. They're things that are, and I find for myself, the any time I can do something that deals with whatever it is that's annoying me, even if maybe or making me down, so to speak. Even if the thing is only a small step towards resolution of whatever it is, somehow I always feel much better when I'm doing something that is contributing in that direction rather than just, oh, this thing is happening. I just have to kind of noodle about it and there's nothing I can do about it. Um, I think one of the challenges in for life uh, like mine um, is in various domains, I've been fairly successful, which is great. And I have also been somebody who keeps in touch with people that I've known throughout my life. I mean, I find the network of people that I know is an important sort of enriching feature of my life. And I've kept in touch with people that I know back to sort of the kindergarten time, so to speak, even though I've moved countries, moved around in the US and so on. I think that that's a nice thing. I think one of the things that gets complicated is that I've done lots of different kinds of things, and so there's sort of the set of people that I know sort of purely socially is strangely small because the people that I sort of know socially, there's something that I've ended up doing that has sort of been connected to the things that they actually do for a living and so on. And that's always been it's a slightly complicated thing. I mean, in you ask about isolated things. Running companies is not the world's least isolated activity because you're working with a bunch of people, and you certainly talk to them, but in the end, it's kind of just you doing what you do. And while you might talk to friends of yours who also run companies and things like this, it's somehow in the end, it's very much of a you're on your own doing what you do kind of thing. And that's certainly something one notices. Let's see. Elsie asks, early memories of encountering ideas and works by von Neumann, especially pertaining computation, my reactions to them. Yeah, I mean, I remember when did I first interact with the works of von Neumann? I certainly remember looking at them a lot when I visited the Institute for Advanced Study in late 1981. I mean, I guess von Neumann had been at the Institute and there was sort of lots of von Neumann stuff there. Um, I, uh, at the time, I was sort of interested in, well, he'd written a book late in his life about computers and brains. Wasn't that impressed with that book, but it was sort of raised interesting questions. Um, and I think I don't think I wasn't a big sort of uh, von Neumann kind of enthusiast, but it was the case that I was sort of thrust into von Neumann studies, so to speak, by spending a little while at the Institute. I remember there was a chap called Julian Bigelow who had been somebody who worked on von Neumann's computer, who was still around at the Institute at that time. I didn't interact much with him, but was sort of one of the human sort of leftovers from the von Neumann era at that time. But then I must have known, when did I first encounter those things? Um, I first sort of, well, I was studying mathematical logic and things like that in particularly by 1979, I studied a whole bunch of kind of mathematical logic and foundations of computation because I was doing that as sort of my preparation for designing SMP, which now eventually sort of has led to Wolfram language and so on. So that was and I must have encountered, I certainly encountered extensively sort of the whole Gödel Turing story. It's worth remembering in those days, Turing was not famous yet. Turing was a niche person. I think the very first time, well, the first time I heard about Turing, I think I mentioned the story before, was from an old classics professor who I knew when I was like 12 years old, who had worked at Bletchley Park during the war and mentioned the name Turing, although he never told me what he had this person, he just said there was this person called Turing and he was interesting and bright, and somehow his interaction with me reminded him of that somehow, and but he would never have said what he did in what the actual work he did at Bletchley Park was, because it was still secret at that time. Although I think I've told the story before. This particular chap, his name was Tom Stevens, um, was was very given to being very enthusiastic about the word ultra, which which was like strangely over enthusiastic about this word, which was something that kind of stuck in my memory. And decades later, when kind of the whole Bletchley Park kind of story of code breaking there was revealed, there had been this project called Ultra there, which I guess this chap had worked on. And this was kind of the very British way of kind of passing on that knowledge without passing on that knowledge, so to speak. Well, let's see. This question here. What has been the role of friendship in your life and how do you view friendship? Oh gosh. My wife will always criticize me for being a very content-oriented interactor with people. Uh, I I enjoy interacting with people. I enjoy people. I've kept, as I say, in touch with people over the course of half a century, more and more. Um, but I have to say that I'm not the small talk person. I'm always kind of, tell me about what you're doing. Tell me about what you know about, talking about things that I feel like I will learn something from and so on, more so. And I find that is a good way. I mean, for me, that's a good way of interacting with people. That's sort of the excuse to have a real conversation, so to speak. I don't think I would get as much. I would say that the thing um, I end up, I suppose I end up being a repository of much advice about lots of kinds of things. I sort of gave up years ago asking for too much advice because people kept on telling me, you know much better than we do, what you should do type thing. So I really, I'm not big on doing that anymore. I liked doing that. I thought it was an interesting, it was helpful to me. Um, but people that I know at least, have this, it's either they say, look, I just don't know, or they might offer something and I'm like, look, I already am 2 miles ahead of that. So it's not particularly useful. But I certainly, I think I really do like to kind of watch the arc of people's lives, I feel like I learn a lot from that, and I kind of there's a certain, I don't know, there's a certain positive thing that I get from kind of the just sort of the investment that's made in kind of knowing somebody over the course of many decades, and kind of the things that that you kind of learn by osmosis from that. I mean, I think one of the things that at my age and stage in life, which is a strange new transition, is that a lot of people my age are retiring or have retired. And I'm so used to talking to people about the future of their lives, so to speak, that uh, it um, that's sort of an adjustment for me, that's a little different now. I have to say, I've gone through periods of my life when, yes, I suppose I could say this. The uh, I always feel like there's the young are interesting because they kind of have new and different ideas, and they're not kind of sort of jaded by all kinds of or made to think conventionally about everything. And in the past, I've always found the old interesting because they have kind of a longer baseline of history. And, when I'll meet your typical 90-something-year-old or whatever, I can always ask them about aspects of history that I don't know, where they have sort of a personal experience of those things. And that's always interesting for me. I have to say, sometimes I've felt that the uh, the people in the middle, the 40-something-year-olds and so on, there's sometimes certainly by no means all, but there can be a situation in which those are people who are sort of just pushing, pushing, pushing in the middle of some career, and they're they're very kind of single-minded, which is probably to the advantage of their career, but it makes them less interesting to me, typically, to kind of hang out with, so to speak. And it's their so I've ended up, at least in the past, with the two ends of the spectrum, so to speak. And I and that's um, it's sort of a little bit uh, I don't know. I was just looking through. I'm about to do a trip to Europe, and I was looking through various universities and things that I'll drop in at, and the faculty lists and so on. And I'm realizing the people who are now sort of active faculty members, I mostly don't know their names. I look at the emeritus list. It's like, yeah, I know all these people. So I think uh, that's kind of a disappointing sign of age and so on. But and I know some of the much younger ones. I just don't know the ones in the middle, so to speak. Let's see. Um, Gabriel is asking, when you look through your scrapbook or writings from years ago, what surprises you most about your past self? Well, it depends how far back. I from sort of age, I don't know, 16 or so, if I look at the things I wrote, I mostly, honestly, I mean, it sounds terrible to say this, but I mostly think this stuff is pretty good. I'm sort of impressed. Um, I would say if I look at my writings from earlier, that I'm I'm kind of like they're sort of ponderous, sometimes a little bit more conventional than I would have, than I would feel I felt like I was, if I look back at things I wrote when I was, I don't know, 10 years old or something, they were things uh, that were a little bit, I would say, more aligned with conventional wisdom than I probably would feel later on. But if I look at things I wrote later, they had they started having a fair degree of kind of creativity and independent thinking fairly quickly, and it's I'm always surprised that there are lots of corners of things that I wrote I just don't remember at all, and it's like, yeah, that was actually an interesting idea, and perhaps an idea that I should have developed further. But that tends to be one thing. I think also in um, a when I look at kind of a a scrapbook of things I was doing long ago, 70s, 80s, whatever, it was like you don't really know the significance of the things you do at the time you do them. And I think a bunch of the things that I was doing were more significant, at least in my life, than I sort of gave them credit for at the time. Now, of course, there's a selection effect because those are the things that survive to make it into the scrapbook, so to speak. I suppose a thing that does strike me is that, if I look at what was happening in, I don't know, 1981, let's say, there's like, and I look at my, calendar from that time, it's like, boy, there are all these things that were sort of significant in my life, and they were happening this week, that week, the next week, so to speak. It's just a lot of things happening quite quickly. And that sort of surprises me because I kind of, it's that it was all packed into that extent. Um, let's see. Larry asks, have you found a half-finished idea in your archives and thought, oh, wow, that was ahead of its time? I have to say all the time. And it's whether it's sort of early thoughts about AI from the late 1970s, or whether it's things about sort of physics and the direction of that, or computation, the direction of that. Yes, there are lots of things where I feel like I did get the right idea, I had the right story. I didn't necessarily have the tools to develop it at the time, or I didn't have the kind of I didn't have the right mechanism to develop it, and I didn't. And I would say that of the things that I see today, maybe half of them are things that I just didn't see coming. There are things where it's just something that came in from the world, came in from even things I've done, but it's just was completely unpredictable to me. And half of it was kind of like, yeah, I kind of knew this was going to happen this way one day. It just was a question of how long it would take. And yes, I'm constantly finding things. I, I found a thing recently that was about Feynman diagrams in particle physics that I wrote in 1978, probably, and was kind of a discussion about why it's useful to compute Feynman diagrams in a symbolic kind of way. And it's, uh, I have to say, it's super modern. It really relates to a lot of what people have done in recent times with various kinds of mathematical structures that come out of just computing Feynman diagrams and noticing the patterns of what happened. I was absolutely onto that in 1978 or so, although I didn't follow up at the time. I did a bunch of that and I got a certain distance with it. But then, decades later, more is known and you can go much further with it. But that's an example of something I just noticed recently where it's like, yeah, I was definitely ahead of that curve. And I think if I look at the things I was saying, writing about sort of my vision of kind of what AI would be like circa 1979 or so, again, I think I didn't foresee a bunch of the details of what's happened, but in big picture, you can certainly read back from what we now know to things that I was thinking about at that time. Although had I pursued it at that time, I don't think I would have gotten anywhere. I think that, I did try to pursue it. I did try to figure out how to make kind of fuzzy pattern matching work. And frankly, I didn't have any particularly good ideas. And I would say one thing that I didn't do, I was very much into things which can be sort of made precise and formalized and so on. The idea of kind of sort of the sort of leaning into the mushiness and arbitrariness of the structure of human knowledge as it is was not something I was ready to do at that time. It's something that decades later I was much more ready to do when we started building Wolfram Alpha and things like this. But at that time, I was looking for things where there was a certain degree of kind of rigorous formalism and precision that you could put around it. And I wouldn't have thought of the idea of just sort of shoveling in, well, is that true? Of just sort of shoveling in knowledge and hoping that it had structure would sort of emerge from that. I think I was thinking at a much more principled level about, but that's actually not quite true because I was certainly thinking about, how do brains work? How does the human visual system work? Things like this back in those days. But as I say, I don't think really had the tools or the or kind of the volume of capability at that time to do much with it. But by the way, I mean, in terms of things I've found that I started to do. One of my great frustrations in life is always projects that I didn't finish. So somebody asked earlier about, was more determined by things I didn't do or things I did do. Thankfully, I've finished. A large number of the projects I started and got any decent distance with, I finished them. And the ones that I didn't finish, sometimes now I'm finishing them, decades later. It's very satisfying, and I could probably have finished them a bit earlier. But I find things like I worked at one time on relativistic solids, which is an interesting topic that I'm sure has still not been resolved, and which where I started writing something about it. I didn't feel I had it really nailed down, so I didn't finish it. Another thing back from 1976, I found a number of years ago was working on neutrino background radiation, the kind of neutrino analog of the cosmic microwave background. And I see people now writing about that. I wrote something back in 1976, but I never felt like it had kind of the killer thing to say, so I never finished it, which is perhaps a shame. But in terms of, I mean, mostly I've sort of learned over the course of my life, don't start projects you can't finish. Don't put a lot of investment into something that will be sort of the half-finished bridge. So, I tend to try and minimize investment in things where I'm not where I don't feel like I can finish them. Gabriel asks, is the state of science and technology today behind or further ahead than your expectations? I haven't, I sort of gave up on figuring out when things are going to happen. I can often figure out what's going to happen, but when, it's so hard to call. I mean, there are so many things that I've built where I kind of know this is the way everything is going to go, whether it's thinking about sort of computational knowledge, computational language, whether it's all these kinds of things about the way one leads one's life and the ways one does science and things like this, all these ideas in science. To me, there's so much that is absolutely inexorable. I have absolutely no doubt that the path of what will happen in technology and science will go in certain ways. And there are ways that I've tried to build. How long it will take to get there, I have no idea. In some cases, I've been waiting for 40 years for people to like, oh, I get it now. And, certainly plenty of people have got those ideas, but not at the level of a breadth that I think eventually they will. But can I say when? No, I can't. There are certainly things about the future that one sort of assumed back in the 1960s. One assumed that space would be an everyday thing, and people would be going to hang out on spend their vacation on the moon type thing. That was a thing that was just sort of assumed back in those days, and of course it didn't happen yet. I remember I was thinking just recently. I remember I had a book. I have to find it again about the future. This must have been 1966 or so, and I remember one picture which had these machines that looked a bit like old-fashioned cash registers. And the description was these were teaching machines that were going to be sort of the automated way to teach everything from 1966 or so. The irony of that is I was just today trying to come up with names for this company we're spinning off that is about kind of computer-based teaching. And I was thinking back to the teaching machines from the 1966 book. Maybe we're finally getting to do it now, some 60 years later or so. Well, in any case, I think that when it comes to computers, it's a funny thing because I've been using computers to do science and so on. I kind of started around 1973. That was a very primitive computer, and it was kind of very limiting. By 1976, I was using big mainframe computers that probably cost millions of dollars. By 1978, I was using so-called mini computers that cost like $250,000 in the currency of the day, but where I could use the whole computer and so on. And, I did a lot of science with that. I have to say, as displays became more capable by 1981, I was sort of always using a bitmap display and so on. I would say that my use of computers has followed a very sort of linear trajectory from that time to today. Most of the things that I'm doing are things which, in principle, I could have done on the computers that I had by 1978 or so. And it's just a question of one's sort of imagination and the sort of tower of capabilities and knowledge that one has, and things I built in technology that let one sort of build up to what we can do today. Now, if we tried running modern Wolfram language on a 1978 computer, it would have started up, it would have run, it would, at least the big computers, not the personal computers of that time. And it would have been a bit painfully slow to do certain kinds of things. But for example, quite a lot of the scientific studies that I've done, I would have been able to get out of the starting gate. There would be plenty that is much easier to do today. That the machines are probably, with all the parallel computation I do, it's probably 10,000 times faster than what I was doing before. But could I get out of the starting gate? Absolutely. If I'd had the right imagination about what to do, I absolutely could have been doing it back then with those kinds of computers. So it's a very kind of linear progression from that time to today, as far as the computers I've used are concerned. I would say, as far as things like kind of access to knowledge, the back in by 1976, I was using these online referencing systems where you could do searches for keywords and abstracts and things like that. That was very useful to me. I could sort of draw a line between that and the early use of the web in the early 1990s. And then today we've got sort of another level of ask your LLM to do kind of thematic searching of the world type thing. But to me, those are, again, I wouldn't have been able to talk about the specifics of how that would get better, but kind of that progression was something that seemed that it was not like the things that I'm seeing today. One was already out of the starting gate in the 1970s with online referencing systems. Same is true with things like I don't know, formatting the things one writes. I mean, I was using a typewriter back in, I switched to using computers for sort of typesetting things, I think in 1979. And by that time, from that time to today, okay, this whole sort of WYSIWYG thing was nice, but the ability of, still people often don't use it. And I'm not, these days, I'm mostly writing Wolfram language code, not writing out kind of traditional math formulas and so on, or if I'm doing it using Wolfram language. But again, it's sort of a straight line from what one had in about 1979 to today. As I say, and similarly, display technology. I mean, I find it amusing. I'll open a Wolfram language notebook that I created in 1989. And the amazing thing is that it still runs today because we've maintained compatibility of Wolfram language across all of those years. But one of the funny things about that notebook is I open it on the screen, it recorded the size it was when it was created, and it's a teeny little thing on the screen. And I realized, gosh, back in those days, that was the screen size. Does it make a fundamental difference? Not really. I can certainly do, there's a quantitative difference in what one can do. I'm not sure that that's such a qualitative difference at this point. Okay, Gabriel asks, if you'd asked the 6-year-old me what he thinks the future of science and technology would be, what would he have said? I would have talked about space, I would have talked about robots, and kind of, well, I wouldn't have called it AI, but I would have talked about kind of electronic brains. I don't think I would have used those terms either. I'm not sure quite what I would have called it, but certainly that was a thing in my awareness, at least. About other things, I'm not sure. I think those are the main things I would have called out as being kind of the features of the future, so to speak. I mean, I don't think I really, I wouldn't have made a distinction at that time between a computer and what it does and sort of a brain-like thing and a robot-like thing. I mean, I didn't even see a computer until I was like 10 years old. There wasn't like there were a huge number of them around. Um, so it's that distinction would have been lost there. Let's see. Entropy asks, how did I skip undergraduate school? Well, I didn't completely skip it. I think I told this long, tortuous story, but the way things worked in England at the time, if you got a quote scholarship, which was more honorific than monetary, to Oxford or Cambridge, you could kind of skip the end of high school exams in England, and so I did that when I was 16. So I went to college. I went to Oxford. I again, the way things were at the time, the only thing you actually had to do was the exams at the end of the year. You didn't really have to do anything else, and I didn't. And I did, physics research and so on. And then by sort of by year two, I'd kind of resolved I was going to go to graduate school, and most places by that time I'd written lots of physics papers and things like this. I was sort of a known character in the international physics scene. So I probably was sort of a special case of these things, but somehow I think I mentioned the three graduate schools that I sort of considered going to and applied to were Princeton, Harvard, and Caltech. And of those, Harvard said, we can't take you unless you have a college degree. The other two didn't really care. So I ended up going to Caltech. Let's see. Weasel asks, what was it like to work at Bell Labs? I was always very impressed with it. I always thought it was very well organized. I mean, it had a sense of purpose that was something different from what I'd seen in academia. It had kind of a sense of we're trying to do projects to actually get things done. I mean, it was sort of charming that, in the end, it was all about the phone system, but sort of the people, and there were, very talented people who were, pretty far away from the phone system. But I remember kind of in all the kind of documents you had to sign and so on, it was things like, you won't do anything that will compromise the integrity of the phone system type thing. And it's like, trust me, I'm pretty far away from the phone system in anything that I'm doing. I was only, a consultant there. I was never a sort of, I spent some time there, but I wasn't kind of a long-term operative there. I would say the thing that I found, it was sort of, it had this kind of sense of organization, like, people who were sort of scientists and so on would occasionally be promoted to be managers. I remember at the time they had this kind of convention that, typical people had kind of offices with, linoleum floors. But if you were a manager, you got a carpet. And, they would literally come in overnight and put down a carpet in some office, and that was, a manager office. And if that office was no longer a manager office, overnight the carpet would disappear, so to speak. I think, but it felt like a place with a lot of energy, particularly in the computer Unix type area. It's like, it felt like there were things that were, something that was done would actually have kind of this implication for things in the world, so to speak. It's whereas in academia, mostly people are just, well, we're writing our next paper and this and that and the other, rather than we're doing things which will have significance in the world. Now, I would say not everything was perfect. I mean, my sort of friend and sort of somewhat former student, Rob Pike, who'd gone there, built this thing called the Blit terminal, which was an early bitmap display, and it had this kind of whole idea of computing on the edge, as one would call it now, with a certain amount of computing on the edge and then going to the cloud, which was over a phone line going to a central computer. And at the time it was like, was Western Electric, which was kind of the licensing company associated with Bell Labs, was it going to really do something with that? and I would say my impression was they really flubbed it. Um, it was um, I remember a few things I wasn't directly involved in, but uh, there was some. I mean, this was a time when there were different levels of electronic switching systems. The number 7 ESS or whatever, which was I think 10 million line switching or something like that, which was the thing for which Unix was originally developed. There was some time, I think, when I was there, I'm trying to remember the details of this, where there was some strike and the folks who maintained these big phone exchanges weren't working, and there was sort of this, oh, some people from Bell Labs would have to go in and actually go inside this the phone exchange in New York City or whatever else. My memory of that story is a little bit vague, but that was kind of a sort of people were excited about even the possibility of seeing sort of inside these facilities. Um, I think yeah. Let's see. Spare Parts asks, speaking of 2001, did you ever meet Stanley Kubrick? No, I did not. Um, let's see. Entropy asks, did you enjoy living in Pasadena, California? I think Pasadena has come a lot up in the world since I was there. When I was there, it was definitely on the retirement plus Caltech type of place. I there was an apartment complex that I lived in where I really didn't interact with anybody. I mean, at all. But it was all sort of older people, and they were kind of like, oh, so and so in apartment such and such, died or went to a nursing home or something like this. Um, Probably, well, it was a nice, quiet apartment complex at least. Um, and I'm sure that I don't think pretty much nobody ever even saw me because I would come back, late at night and so on. And I don't think I really I barely ever talked to anybody there. In fact, I don't remember ever talking to anybody there. Um, but when I first arrived in Pasadena, I think one of the things that was notable to me um, was um, uh, there were all these very manicured green lawns, and yet, it was very hot, and I couldn't really see how that could work. And then I was out, probably the very first day I was there, practically late at night, and up should pop a sprinkler, which you know, uh, got me wet, but also got the grass wet. And I was like, okay, now I understand how this works, and it's really weird. And I'd never seen anything like that in England, um, and so on. But I think I really didn't have much interaction with the kind of uh, the town of Pasadena. I was really very much just hanging out in one physics building, one floor of one physics building at Caltech most of the time, and riding my bicycle to and from an apartment that and not interacting with anybody there. So I was not really heavily interacting with the town. I will say one thing though. There was a burger joint called the Burger Continental, which was the place I used to often go to have dinner, and it was run by I think Armenian brothers, if I remember correctly, Gary and Larry or something. And yeah, they were always very cheerful, and there was kind of and I managed to get probably not incredibly wholesome, but nevertheless food that provided energy there. I have to say, one of the things perhaps funny is that I guess I was one of these slow-growing humans who was still kind of, when I got to Caltech, I think I still was growing a little bit at age 18 or something. And perhaps that was fueled by the fine meat from that establishment. But anyway, many years later, I was back at Caltech, and I was like, I wonder what happened to that place. And the person who was kind of showing me around said, well, actually, those brothers who owned that place, they now own this whole block of fancy buildings of high level office buildings and so on. So I thought that was kind of a, that was a nice ending to that story. Let's see. Who is the most famous person you've ever met? Wow, I've met lots of people. I mean, depends on your scale of fame. I mean, I've met uh, gosh, lots of politicians, lots of I've met a certain number of Hollywood people, scientists. I don't know how to answer that question. I think that's and uh, the I don't know. Yeah, let's see. Larry asks, what's changed more over your lifetime, the way you think or the way you record your thinking? It's a good question. I mean, for me, I have become bolder and I think more effective in the way that I think. I mean, I kind of, up until when I was probably 16 or so, I think I was, well, I was sort of from age about 10 to about 16 was kind of the period when I kind of broke out of being a conventional thinker, I think. I mean, I kind of got much more into I will think foundationally about things because that way I think I'll know that I know what I'm talking about, even if I'm going off off the script of what one is supposed to know about. And so I think that, I mean, that has become all the more so as I've gone through my life that, I like to think foundationally about things. I don't, when it's like that's a big problem, that's a big thing. People have thought about that for a century and haven't figured it out. I've become much less afraid of thinking about those kinds of things, probably because I've had decent success many times in kind of being able to think about things that people didn't think about for us or didn't figure out for a century. But the main reason they didn't figure it out is because they didn't think about it for a century, because they kind of decided it was too hard and everybody avoided it. So I think I've become a bit bolder in thinking about things. I also have learnt over time the kinds of mistakes that I make in thinking. I mean, it's certainly true of programming. I've become, I think I'm a pretty decent programmer at this point and have been for a long time. But the big sort of learning path there was what kinds of mistakes do I make? And when something goes wrong, how do I know, how do I guess what kind of mistake I made? I would think a thing that I've become progressively better at is knowing when I know, so to speak, knowing when I'm really confident that I've built something from the foundations and I really kind of know the steps and I know what I'm talking about versus when I don't know that I when I things that I'm better at knowing things I don't know about. And I've had more experience in seeing different fields and realizing that the ways of thinking in those fields are different. And when I see sort of alien thinking, I don't immediately assume that, this is just a wrong way to do it. It's like that's the way it's done in that field, and there's probably some depth to it. It's just not something that I know about. Um, in terms of recording the things that I do, I mean, I started sort of using computers as a kind of an everyday thing by, well, I was using the ARPANET by 1976, but in terms of a sort of persistent storage, I've had sort of persistent storage on computers since 1979. Um, I have actual file systems from 1981. They are somewhat frustratingly, they're on 9-track magnetic tape. We finally read all of them, I think, by now, but it took some effort to be able to do that in modern times. But so I think I have sort of continuity of storing things on computers back to about 1981. From 1989 onward, I have very complete sort of archiving of things I've done, and sort of everything is computerized. I would say I made the effort to scan basically every paper document I have, at least all the ones that aren't just scraps of paper that I wrote notes on. It's about a third of a million pages, and I looked there from looking at things where there's dated material. I kind of had this plot years ago of kind of what were the dates on that material. It peaks in 1984, and then it decays. So I think 1984 was when I sort of turned the corner to everything really being stored on computers and kind of not doing the physical paper kind of way of doing things. I would say that my kind of the way I've taken notes as I try and work on things, well, with notebooks and Wolfram language from 1988, that's been my way of taking notes for the last, 37 years or whatever. The I think uh, if I look at what I was doing before that time, it was kind of the paper analog of that. And I would often kind of cut out with scissors some piece of computer output on paper and put it in with Scotch tape into the notes that I had. So it was kind of the notebook, the notebook in our sense before the notebook, so to speak, but with Scotch tape rather than copy paste the cell, so to speak. Let's see. Oh boy, what are some of the oh, there's a lot of questions here. Let me see. What are some of the scientific beefs or conflicts you've witnessed in your lifetime between ideologies or individuals? Oh gosh, when I was in particle physics, uh, there were lots of people who couldn't stand each other. And uh, I think more for reasons of personality than for reasons of intellectual uh, ideology and so on. I would say that uh, the things I've witnessed for myself, there are plenty of things that I've done in my life where people are like, that's just completely crazy thing to do. It's interesting that I've had, when I was doing particle physics, I started doing cosmology kinds of things. There was a certain sense of that, but mostly it was, oh, we don't really know what that is. We don't really care. Then when I started working on simple programs, computational universe, cellular automata, things like that, there was a high degree of, I have no idea what this is, I don't care type thing. And with a small component of kind of, well, sort of bemusement about the whole thing, more so than anything else. I would say when I worked on sort of my first big computer system, SMP, there was a certain degree of animosity in people who were sort of already in that general area and like the John McCarthys of this world who thought, this was all had to work through AI and Lisp and so on, and that wasn't the way I was doing it. But it's been very variable. I mean, I think I mentioned, when Wolfram Alpha came out, there was not, it wasn't a sort of a clash conflicted type thing. Just when New Kind of Science, my big book came out, most of it also wasn't a clash conflicted kind of thing, except with my friends, the physicists, some of whom were like, we don't need anything new here. I would say that um, there are there are often things in technology, I've seen more of these things where people say the future is, uh, like the future is expert systems AI back in the 1980s, and or the future is, and then some particular technology, which it really isn't, where that really isn't the future. And I've seen been exposed to lots of kind of instances of that. I would say in, I've been pretty far away from is it string theory or not in physics? I've always thought that that was kind of an interesting mathematical structure, but pretty far away from kind of the deployment, so to speak, in the physical world. Um, so that's a few comments on that. Ivy asks, what was your experience during the shift when cell phones became commonly used? Did I enjoy the new tech or struggle with it at first? Oh, I loved the new tech. Back in the day, this must have been 1987. Uh, people, these phones were the size of a shoe, and they had sort of an antenna sticking up, and they kind of looked like a mobile version of kind of the telephone handset type things. And I remember you could rent them with cars at that time, and I did that particularly when I was visiting San Francisco Bay Area and so on. I would always, rent a phone so that I was reachable as I sort of drove around. And then later on, you could sort of get a phone built into your car. This was in the cell phone era. This was after and I think the first phone I remember when I got first flip phone, that must have been was for my birthday when I was 30 years old. So that must have been 1989. That was the before that I had had some much clunkier phone, And then, I got this nice flip phone that looked like a Star Trek communicator type thing. I remember sort of many generations of phones. I remember one of the things that used to be true on phones is you could actually see the cell phone towers. It would have a little thing where it would list the cell phone towers that it got signal from, and you could, if the thing didn't switch over to a different cell phone tower, you could push it and get it to, you just say switch to that other tower with a different signal strength. They took that feature out long ago, which was a shame because that really, whenever it doesn't switch for me, which happens too often, and it's frustrating that feature isn't there. But then, I remember there was some very bizarre time when it was sort of said to be against the rules to use a headset when you were, uh, driving with a cell phone, and it's like, how can this possibly be right? I remember at the same time in Switzerland, it was compulsory to use a headphone if you were using a cell phone. But in some states in the US, it was against the rules, supposedly, and of course it changed eventually. But that was a different thing. But I tend to be an early adopter of technology, and I certainly found cell phones super useful. And I think usually for making outgoing calls rather than getting incoming calls. I mean, I remember back in the day having pagers and things, and then there were pagers, there were two-way pagers, and so on that were yeah, I think that was at a time when why did I have that? I had those for ages. I don't really quite remember why. Maybe when my kids were very young, but that uh, I'm not sure. I remember when there was the big pager outage in the US because the pager satellite, I didn't even actually know they were operated from a satellite, had failed. Well, um, so a question here maybe for another time. Um, let's see. Let me just go down, pick a few questions for further down here. Oddvark asks, what's the most difficult subject you've ever learnt? I always find math hard. People say rather, math is hard. Math has many branches. It's very abstract. Um, the uh, I have learnt it when I've needed to use it. I have not sort of learnt it as a tower for the sake of learning it, so to speak. But I would say that's probably the field that I found the hardest to sort of learn in a to sort of jump in and learn. There are other fields that if I look at something like philosophy, um, I have a hard time just sort of extracting the point. If I'll read some old philosophical work, it'll be I have it's a complicated struggle for me to say, how do I take these ideas and mold them into something that I understand? I think I'm always one of these people who there's certain kinds of things that one's good at some things, one's bad at others. I will say that an example of something I'm really bad at. I don't know why I'm so bad at it. Is if I'll go and see a Shakespeare play, I can't understand anything anybody's saying. I mean, other people I know, including my kids and my wife, they'll be like, "Oh, I understand this perfectly," and I'm like, "I don't know those words. That's Old English. I don't know it." Well, not even Old English actually, but for some reason I'm rather bad at doing something where I kind of have to suspend a lack of knowledge, and that happens sometimes with math. There'll be something where you don't really understand the definition, but you want to keep on going anyway. And maybe also in philosophy, reading philosophy, I find that difficult. And for me, it's much better if I can sort of build one solid brick foundation, and just build from there. I can deal with pretty tall towers, but they kind of have to be built on solid foundations. Um, let's see. Question here from Bob. Who do you think was the most intelligent person you ever met? The one key thing is intelligence is by no means a linear scale. By no means. I mean, there are people who have been at the things they do very impressive, and whether it's math or whether it's something that is a more kind of practical skill or something. There are people where it's like, wow, I could never do it that well type thing. And but when it comes to sort of the all around, oh, this is a person I would just sort of uh, ask about for anything, um, I'm hard pressed to know. I don't think it's a sort of a linear scale. I mean, in my own life, I think I mentioned this. I had the interesting experience of knowing a bunch of very bright kids when I was in kindergarten. So it's kind of been downhill from there, so to speak. And I've often thought, for many years, I thought, I'll go to the next place and everybody here will be unbelievably much smarter than anything I've seen before. But that never really happened. But that isn't, so I don't have a good answer for that. Um, let's see. Marco mentions that I mentioned that I got to know Cormac McCarthy through the MacArthur Foundation get-togethers, and is asking, have I read his books? I'm embarrassed to say the answer to that is basically no. He sent me his last book, which was gosh, what was it called? Um, it was I think one piece of it was called Stella Maris or something, but the whole thing had a different name. But it's a book. He told me he's writing a book about somebody who's influenced by the mathematician Grothendieck, and and asked me a bunch of questions about that. But I couldn't not read that book. But I started it. It was challenging for me, and I feel terrible for not having read these books, but I haven't. Uh, I'm not a big reader of fiction. I somehow I am well aware of the fact that fiction is a concentrated way to communicate many kinds of things more effectively than if you just sort of lay it out, statement, statement, statement about the human condition. Fiction is a much better way to present many of those kinds of things, but I'm just not. It doesn't happen to be something where I can kind of I feel like I can't sort of justify it in the sense that I'm kind of it's it's like, well, I could be doing something where I'm doing something which directly contributes to some project I'm doing, and fiction doesn't directly do that. Um, let's see. Uh, well, Javi asks, what's the funniest or strangest thing that ever happened at one of my lectures? Oh boy, there are many. I think I mentioned one time I had a computer that switch it on and it basically exploded. That was an interesting start. I've certainly had sometimes, you might think that, you'd get sort of the aggressive questions and things like this. Doesn't usually happen in practice. And when it does happen, it's people, the audience is often very surprised because like you get some very strange question, and it's like those are interesting, even if it's kind of an aggressive question. I remember one time, person, this was a chap called Vel Kahan, who was the creator of the IEEE floating point standard, or at least one of its creators. I was giving some talk. This must have been, oh gosh, when was this? Sometime in the 80s. And, I was talking about kind of symbolic computation and the way that we deal with arithmetic and arithmetic errors and so on. I've never been a big fan of the IEEE floating point standard because it kind of doesn't show you when the digits in a number are wrong. It's just like you don't in Wolfram language, you get to see, what the precision of a number is, at least if you're using arbitrary precision arithmetic. Whereas with the IEEE floating point standard, which is what we're stuck with most modern hardware, it's kind of like it's just going to give you 16 digits of precision, whether they're right or not. And I always used to say to Velkahan that this was such a horrible thing. And he says, well, but people should know numerical analysis and be able to see whether the digits are going to be correct. And I'm like, well, that's your business, but it's not for everybody. But anyway, I remember one time I was giving some talk, and he stood up and made some giant speech about how this is all terrible and it's all, nonsense and so on and so on and so on. And I didn't know quite what to say. And I sort of ended up just the first thing that came out of my mouth was kind of like, was there a question in all of that? I hadn't really realized because I couldn't figure it out. And of course, the audience then all started laughing, which was a kind of hadn't been really what I'd intended, but that's what happened. I think another time I'm remembering this was a bad time. This was it was after New Kind of Science came out, and I was going around the US giving talks about it at a bunch of different universities. One place where I was going to give a talk was Caltech, and there was a chap there who was not somebody I think who liked me very much, who had, by that point was the provost, a chap called Steve Kunin. And he somehow, it had been sort of arranged I was going to give this talk, and it was kind of, well, can it be kind of a discussion? It's like, okay, fine. Can it be a debate? And I was like, yes, but not something gladiatorial, because that will not end well. In other words, if it's like, I'm going around giving talks about the stuff I've done and so on, don't have something where it's kind of like a bunch of people sort of set up to, be the attack team. I said, not because I care about having an attack team, I think that's kind of interesting, but because, I know this material very well and I'm not a bad public speaker and it just won't end well. But nevertheless, it's like, no, we're not going to do that. And I show up there. It happened to be the day that, which was it, the second space shuttle that crashed, and it was that had happened just I think maybe early that morning or something. And Caltech is a place connected to JPL, connected to a lot of things in the space program. That was not an auspicious thing to have happen that day. And I think some people at least were kind of upset about it. And probably we should have just canceled the talk, but we didn't. And it was a disaster because it was kind of a thing where there were some people sort of set up to be the attackers. And it was silly because, as I predicted, I know the material very well. I've thought about all these issues. I'm not a bad public speaker. And the audience was just, horribly kind of more or less jeering at these characters. And it was just it was a bad thing. I think there's a video of it, but I think it's been suppressed. It was bad. That was one of those that was not the finest moment. The other things that have happened in talks I've given. I mean, I think I mentioned one that was a rather charming one at a talk I gave at Bell Labs, where somebody I'm showing something and somebody says, what about the case of 37 or something? It was turned out to be a chap called Andrew Odlisko, who sometime after that ran the math part of Bell Labs, and I ended up collaborating with him on some things. That was kind of a fun one of how on earth did you know that, to ask that question. I would say I'm not immediately thinking of other wild stories of I mean, one thing that I will say about giving talks in different situations is you go around the world. I've been giving talks with computer demos since 1980 or so. And there's always setting up the equipment and getting things to work and all that kind of thing. You go to places, very outlying places in the world, and everything works perfectly. And then you go to some place that's like, it's got the highest tech, the best things, and things fail. I remember I gave a talk at TED in 2010, I think, and they had this, incredible AV setup with, giant machines and all this kind of thing. And it's like, I'm just going to plug this computer in, and it just didn't work. And it took, fortunately, we sort of tried it the day before, and for hours we were trying to debug this thing. And it was like, oh, well, actually, the projector was sending an EDID string to the computer that was really the wrong thing, and this and that and the other, and the projector was kind of lying about its capabilities, and the computer was getting confused, all that kind of thing. But it was kind of the inverse of what you would expect. You would expect in a super high production value setting, just you plug it in and it works. But I've noticed it's kind of a uniform distribution from the places which are like, well, we don't really have reliable internet, but we do have some kind of projector or something. It works great. And then the places that are super high production values, it often fails. Um, what's the oddest collaboration, Jamie asks, that you've ever had? I'm not a great collaborator. I mean, I've worked with many people at our company. Um, the um, in when I was kind of in the science business before that, uh, I worked with people. I don't think it was ever terribly odd. I mean, there were cases where I did have a criterion at some point. You can't be a co-author of the paper if you don't understand what the paper says. That was that led to some troubles at a few times. Um, I would say that in terms of uh, not really a collaboration, but something that comes to mind. Years ago, a chap, I get a lot of strange pieces of mail. I had this piece of mail where somebody is explaining some dream that they had, which involved sort of I guess, some war and cellular automata and a bunch of other things. Anyway, I usually I would read a sentence or two, and it was quite well written, so I kept reading, and it was like, this is totally wild, but really quite interesting and quite, whoever wrote this, has a clue. And so we kind of tracked down who it was, and it was a young chap just uh, graduating from sort of a high-end undergraduate degree, and ended up hiring him, worked for the company for many years very successfully. That was kind of one of the more unlikely kinds of how you run into people type situations. Um, I think I should get going in a moment here, but maybe um, one more question. Bob is asking, did I know that some people don't have an internal monologue? Have you met such people? Do you think in words or pictures? I'm not sure I have a great inner monologue. I mean, I think I mostly think by typing things into computers. Um, you know, uh, I I occasionally will start drawing these weird, incomprehensible pictures on a piece of paper, um, and but which somehow you know scaffold the things I'm thinking about. Um, but I think I'm not a great one for just silently think, so to speak. I mean, I end up doing lots of thinking, but it's always my fingers are moving, so to speak, and I'm typing something, and my computer is helping me, and things like that. Um, I I tend to find I think I tend to find visualizing things super useful. I'm not at all a good mental visualizer of things. I may get the computer to show it to me, then I can absorb the information well. But if it's like, imagine what that, dodecahedron, if you rotate it, is like from a different angle, I'm absolutely useless at that. Um, I think I am probably more of a sort of formalized logic algebra type thinker than a geometrical one. I mean, I do tend to like kind of structure where I can say it's this thing, this thing, this thing, and you transform it this way. I guess I'm kind of describing my lifelong kind of symbolic programming story, because that is the way I tend to think about things, more so than, oh, you've got this geometrical thing and it kind of sort of floats around and does this or that. That I find much harder to deal with than the kind of rigidity of kind of there's this structure and it's transformed to this other structure in this very rigid way. Um, let's see. Should probably go to my day job here. Um, lots of other interesting questions. Well, let's see. Guillermo says they're currently developing an AI hardware and software company. Wanted to ask, what are some of the more remarkable experiences you had when working at Thinking Machines Corporation? Any insights you had there or in other parts of your career? Well, I'll say a few things. I think I talked about this a little bit back in the early to mid 1980s. I was a consultant at Thinking Machines Corporation, which was building a massively parallel computer. I think my main contributions were probably the suggestion that it have flashing lights. Maybe that had been had independently. I think I was the one who suggested it to its the CTO, Danny Hillis. I think I also suggested the name of the company because I think it was sort of a takeoff of the company called Research Machines that my friend Tim Robinson had worked for. The name of the company, these things often happens that way, was eventually a bad idea because it was eventually it was a name based on the notion that it was going to be building AI systems. But in the end, it was mostly trying to build supercomputers competing with Cray and things like this and selling things that people would otherwise think were running Fortran and so on. I would say that the thing, gosh, I think I told some of these stories actually before, so I probably shouldn't repeat myself. But there were definitely it was a very vibrant group of people, very good sort of human curation effort, I would say, mostly work of Cheryl Handler, it's the CEO of Thinking Machines, together with sort of the very interior designed office space and so on that I tended to think contributed to the general sort of notion of doing something important. I mean, I do have to remember that there was a kind of a placard up that was a quote from Danny that Cheryl had up, which was, I want to build a computer that will be proud, that can be proud of me, which I thought was probably not its finest moment, but I think the somehow it was there was a notion of sort of this was a place where things were happening and lots of the new was going to be invented, and lots of things were invented. I mean, there was for example, the waste system which Brewster Kahle worked on, and that sort of became was a competitor to Gopher and sort of a competitor to the web before the web. And then there were all kinds of things with natural language processing. And there was one interesting project which was a direction assistance system for driving directions. And as an out-of-towner, I got to be the one who probably volunteered to test it. And it was a very weird experience because it was before cell phones. And so you would stop at a payphone, and I guess it had some way of getting the what number you were calling from information. I don't think you had to type that in. And it had a map of the payphones, and it would kind of read you with a voice synthesizer. I remember there was a Deck Talk voice synthesizer that was always fun to play with at Thinking Machines. I subsequently got one of those of my own. It was a thing made by Digital Equipment Corporation. It was a thing where, ASCII text went in and spoken words came out. And it wasn't bad. It was, but anyway, that was you got spoken directions over the phone. I got irreducibly lost. It was like 5 hours of driving around Boston. I am I'm not very good without in those days a map, or these days a GPS. I'm not a particularly good direction finder as a human, so to speak, and that played to my weaknesses. But it was a sort of an interesting experience of a kind of a new thing being explored there. I think it was a place where a lot of new directions were followed, but the core was this sort of, in the end, single user, massively parallel AI targeted computer, which wasn't quite the right place in the market. And I think it was always Cheryl was always very keen to sell computers only to places that would really do production type work with them. I remember Dun and Bradstreet bought such a computer. I always thought it was kind of like you buy one of these computers, your stock price goes up by more than the cost of the computer because people think you must be modern if you're buying all this cool computing stuff. But it was, just companies that you wouldn't really expect would be sort of into these kinds of things. And I don't know how much use was ever got in those particular places from this, but I think that was I was always pushing for sell it to the government labs, sell it to the research places, because this is a thing where you can do research on it. It's not necessarily a thing where it's reached the point where it's sort of a production grade, a thing where you can, run your airline, timetable optimization from it and so on. I think I need to go to my day job, but thanks for those questions. And I feel like this waypoint of talking about life so far is, I feel like sometimes it's one might, I feel in a particularly energetic state these days, and just an awful lot of stuff is happening. So I look forward to having obsoleted and outdated most of the things I've had to say, or many of the things I've had to say in these discussions. But anyway, thanks for joining me. And I think by next time we will probably be back to my regular program of live streams and Q&As and so on. Although it's been interesting to take this diversion and break. And thanks for joining me for that. All right, well, got to go back to my day job. So bye for now.